When I opened the letter taped to my front door, I actually laughed. $1 million fine for unauthorized structures, land misuse, and non-compliance with architectural standards. I live on 5 acres of private land, and somehow the HOA thought they had a say over it. Let me rewind. My name's Xander Zoll. I'm a welder by trade, built my home with my own 2 hands. The house sits on land I inherited from my grandfather. He bought it before the town even had street signs. For 20 years, it's been quiet out here. No neighbors, no problems. Then Oak Hollow Estates got built next to my northern property line. Gated community, cookie-cutter homes, and the worst part, an HOA run by a woman named Pamela Dritch. Blonde bob, pastel cardigans, permanent scowl. The kind of woman who calls the cops when kids use sidewalk chalk. She introduced herself by walking right up my driveway and telling me my workshop was an eyesore from the private road her community shared with mine. This is a violation of HOA aesthetics, she sniffed, pointing at my steel barn and the solar panels I mounted last spring. I'm not in your HOA, I said, not even looking up from my angle grinder. Well, your property borders ours, and your choices affect our property values, she snapped. So we'll be issuing fines until this is resolved. I laughed then, too. Good luck with that. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I'd received 5 letters, each increasing in hostility. The last one, hand-delivered by Pamela herself, came with a glossy folder of photos she must have taken from the border fence. She'd circled things in red marker. My firewood stack, the rainwater barrels, even my dog's house. This is your final notice, she said, holding it out like a court summons. I'm not paying a dime, I replied. You'll be hearing from our legal committee, she said, and turned on her orthopedic heels. I thought she was bluffing. Then I got the envelope from the HOA's lawyer. Certified mail. A full legal packet. According to them, I owed $1 million in cumulative fines. They claimed that when Oak Hollow Estates was chartered, they annexed a portion of adjacent land for aesthetic oversight. My land. I drove straight to the city planning office. The clerk, an older guy named Roger, pulled up the maps. When I told him what the HOA claimed, he raised an eyebrow. They can't annex anything without the owner's consent, he said. They say they did, I replied. He printed the records. Well, they didn't. I stared at the document that proved it. My land was completely outside their jurisdiction. But somehow they'd filed architectural complaints with the county using forged boundaries. Looks like someone got creative with their filings, Roger said. I nodded slowly. Pamela Dritch, HOA president. Well, if they're making legal threats based on false documents. He leaned in. You might want to talk to a lawyer. And the sheriff. I wasn't just going to talk to them. I was going to evict the HOA from my land permanently. And I already had a plan. The front desk at the sheriff's department was quiet that morning, save for the low hum of a ceiling fan and the occasional crackle of a police radio. I handed over the folder. Roger helped me put together county maps, certified land boundaries, and a copy of the HOA's bizarre legal threat. Deputy Marla Kessler flipped through the pages. Her brow furrowed deeper with each one. Did they really file this with the county assessor's office? She asked, holding up a document with a hand-drawn map and a forged signature block. They did, I said. And they're using it to extort me for $1 million. She picked up the phone without another word and called back to her captain. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from Captain Ruiz himself in his office, where the walls were lined with old photographs of search and rescue crews and dusty commendations. They forged municipal documents to expand their HOA? He asked, flipping a page. That's not just overreach. That's criminal. They're presenting it like it's legally binding, I said, and threatening legal action based on it. Ruiz leaned back in his chair. You mind if we hang on to these for a bit? We'll need to get the district attorney involved. Be my guest. Before I left, they made copies of everything and took my official statement. Ruiz promised they'd pull the filings themselves and speak with the county registrar. I walked out knowing the fuse was lit, but I wasn't done. That night, I opened the steel case I kept under my workbench. Inside was a drone I'd built from scratch for welding inspections. I'd upgraded it with a high-def camera and thermal imaging. It was time to put it to a different use. I launched it from the edge of my workshop and sent it drifting silently over the treeline. Oak Hollow Estates sat like a pristine dollhouse set beyond the fence. I wasn't looking for landscaping violations. I was looking for proof. 20 minutes later, I had it. The drone caught footage of Pamela and 2 other board members standing at the edge of my property line on my side of the fence. They were using survey equipment and marking flag stakes into the dirt. One of them had a clipboard with what looked like a parcel map. They weren't just bluffing. They were trying to physically redefine the property line without permits, without consent, and without any lawful authority to do so. I saved the footage to a secure drive and printed stills. The next morning, I walked into the city recorder's office and asked for all survey permits filed in the last 30 days by Oak Hollow Estates. There were none. I left with a certified statement to that effect. That same afternoon, my neighbor from across the way, a retired Marine named Joe Hargrove, showed up at my garage. "You hear what they're saying now?" he asked, resting one hand on the fender of my truck. "Pamela's telling people you're building a junkyard, that you're going to drag down their market value." I laughed. "They're trespassing and forging documents. I'm not the one tanking values." He handed me a folded flyer. It was a printout of a petition Pamela's latest stunt, asking Oak Hollow residents to vote in favor of civil reclamation of my land under community preservation rights. "They're trying to get signatures to push this to the county board," Joe said. "But folks are starting to ask questions." "Good," I said, "because I've got answers." That night I called in a favor. My cousin Lila was a real estate attorney in the city. She didn't usually take cases outside the metro, but when I told her what was happening, she drove out the next day with a briefcase and an attitude. They filed a fraudulent annexation claim and used it to attempt civil extortion, she said, flipping through the folder I gave her. "That's not a civil dispute, Xander. That's felony fraud. And they're trespassing," I added. "Let me guess, no easement?" "None." She exhaled and smiled in a way that meant trouble for someone. "Then we've got them on criminal trespass, unauthorized surveying, and attempted property theft. That's separate from the fraud. I want them off my land and served papers so hard they feel it in their fillings." "You'll get it." Lila filed a motion for a cease and desist that same day, backed with the drone footage, the city's official maps, and the lack of permits. Within 48 hours, a temporary restraining order was issued against the Oak Hollow HOA board, barring them from coming within 20 feet of my property line. The next Saturday, I set up a projector and invited the local press to my shop. Joe brought folding chairs and coolers, and before long, a dozen neighbors trickled in. Even a reporter from the county paper showed. I played the drone footage on the side of my barn. The crowd watched silently as Pamela and her crew marched across my land with survey equipment, planting flags and scribbling on maps. When it ended, I turned to the crowd. "They say they're protecting your neighborhood," I said, "but they're lying to the county, forging documents, and trespassing to steal land that doesn't belong to them." The reporter raised her hand. "Do you have anything filed against them?" I handed her a copy of the restraining order. "More's coming," I said. "They're about to find out that fake fines don't work when you're the one breaking the law." That night, Pamela showed up again, but this time, flanked by 2 men in golf shirts with HOA badges clipped to their belts. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed from the road, not daring to cross the line marked by the court order I'd posted on a sign. "No," I said. I just know how to read a deed. One of the men tried stepping forward, but Joe appeared from behind my truck, arms crossed. You're on thin ice, I said. And the sheriff's department already has your forged documents. Pamela's face turned white. You're going to regret this, she snapped. I pointed to the sign. Trespass again, and I'll let the deputies escort you off in front of your whole neighborhood. They left. The next week, subpoenas landed. Pamela and 2 board members were summoned for questioning by the DA's office. The county registrar filed a formal complaint against the HOA for falsified annexation documents. And then came the real kicker. The county commission opened an investigation into Oak Hollow Estates charter. Turns out this wasn't their first time pulling something like this. 3 years ago, in another development across town, a nearly identical scheme had been attempted. Same lawyer, same language in the documents, same architectural committee head. Pamela had done this before, but this time they picked the wrong neighbor, and I was just getting started. On the second Monday after the subpoenas were served, I got a call just after sunrise. It was Lila. Her tone was clipped, focused. They didn't just forge annexation documents, she said. One of the signatures on the plats belongs to a man who's been dead for 6 years. I sat down slowly on the bench outside my workshop. The morning air smelled like pine and iron. You're saying they faked a dead man's approval? I asked. They used his name, his title as a former planning commissioner, and even included an outdated county seal, she said. I confirmed with the registrar's office none of it's valid, and the notary stamp they used doesn't exist. She paused. This just went from county-level fraud to criminal conspiracy. I exhaled through my nose, feeling the weight of that shift. This wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. Someone had committed document fraud using the identity of a deceased public official, all to justify a land grab. Lila continued, I've already contacted the state attorney's office. They're sending an investigator. This is big enough to trigger a formal inquiry into the HOA's charter status. By noon, 2 unmarked sedans rolled down the gravel access road and parked near the barn. The investigator, a tall woman named Denise Rourke, stepped out wearing jeans and a windbreaker that said State Fraud Unit. She introduced herself and asked if I'd be willing to walk her through everything I had. I showed her the physical boundaries, the flags still embedded in the north field, and the footage from my drone. She took notes on a digital tablet, then asked to see the original HOA letters. As she flipped through them, her expression hardened. They didn't just fabricate documents, she said. They attempted a hostile claim on private property using falsified governmental authority. That's a felony under state code. She asked to speak with Joe next. I waved him over from where he was pressure washing his trailer. He gave her a full account of the petition Pamela had circulated and how she'd framed it at the last HOA meeting. She said the county gave them special zoning considerations and that your land was a legal gray area, he said. She told folks they needed to act quickly before you built a mechanical landfill. Denise raised an eyebrow. Did she present any documents to support that claim? She had a binder, Joe said, but no one saw it up close. She kept flipping pages and talking fast. Denise nodded slowly. Sounds like she was trying to overwhelm them with fake authority. She left with a full copy of everything Lila had filed on my behalf, plus the drone footage and a notarized statement from Joe. Before she drove off, she looked at me and said, "You're going to want to be home tomorrow morning." The next day, I was up at 5. I made coffee and waited, boots on, gate open. At exactly 7, 5 black SUVs with official plates pulled up at Oak Hollow's main gate. A dozen agents in windbreakers exited, fanned out, and began knocking on doors. From my vantage point, I could see Pamela's 2-story cream-colored house at the corner of the cul-de-sac. 2 agents went up her walkway. A few minutes passed. Then I heard shouting. Pamela was escorted out in handcuffs, wearing a silk robe and slippers. One of the agents was carrying a file box. Another followed with a laptop bag. A third held what looked like a ledger book. More board members followed the treasurer, the architectural review head, even the community events coordinator. All of them were taken from their homes and placed in the waiting SUVs. Joe joined me at the edge of my property, arms crossed, watching it unfold. "You know what the crazy part is?" he said. "They were planning a wine and cheese mixer on Saturday. Guess it's canceled." "They should have stuck to cheese," I said. "Less jail time." By noon, the county commission held an emergency meeting. I didn't attend, but Lila went in my place and called me afterward. The commission voted unanimously to suspend Oak Hollow's charter pending full investigation, she said. "That means the HOA can't issue fines, hold meetings, or enforce codes. Everything's frozen." "That's not just a win," I said. "That's a full stop." She chuckled. "We're not done. The state is also reviewing their nonprofit status. If they find financial misconduct, and I'm guessing there'll be tax fraud charges too." Later that week, a group of Oak Hollow residents came to my gate. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect, but instead of complaints, they brought apologies. A middle-aged man with a clipboard stepped forward. He introduced himself as Calvin Price, a former HOA member who'd stepped down 6 months ago. "We didn't know how far she was taking things," he said. "When we started asking questions, she shut us out, deleted meeting minutes, claimed we weren't on the executive list anymore." I nodded. "She forged documents using a dead man's name. You weren't the only ones kept in the dark." He held out the clipboard. "We're organizing a dissolution vote. If we get enough signatures, we can shut the HOA down permanently. We were hoping you'd support it even though you're not technically a member." I took the pen and signed. After they left, I walked the northern boundary of my property one last time. The flags Pamela had planted had been pulled up during the investigation, leaving faint impressions in the dirt. I replaced them with small wooden posts painted bright red and topped with reflective tape. Not as a warning, just a reminder. That night, I installed a motion-activated spotlight facing the old path where their survey team had trespassed. I didn't expect them to come back, but I wanted it clear. This land wasn't theirs to take, then or ever. The next week, Denise returned with an update. She stood by the barn looking satisfied. "We executed a warrant on their office records," she said. "Turns out this wasn't just about your land. They had plans to target other adjacent lots. Yours was just the test case." "Let me guess," I said. "They never expected anyone to push back. They assumed most people wouldn't know the laws well enough to stop them," she replied. "But you had documentation, legal support, and patience. That's rare." I asked what would happen to Pamela and her crew. "They're facing charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying public records, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property," she said. Bail was denied for 2 of them. The judge called it an abuse of public trust. Lila filed a civil claim on my behalf the same week. Not for damages. I didn't care about the cost of defending myself, but the emotional toll, the time, and the sheer audacity of what they tried warranted a reckoning. When the court ruled in my favor 2 months later, the judgment included a permanent injunction against Oak Hollow Estates and its board members from interfering with my property in any capacity. They were also fined 6 figures in restitution, which was to be distributed across legal fees, community impact, and a formal apology published in the county paper. On the morning the notice ran, Joe brought over 2 lawn chairs and a thermos of coffee. "Thought we'd enjoy the sunrise," he said, setting the paper on the table between us. Headlines read, "HOA leaders indicted in massive land fraud scheme." Beneath it, a photo of Pamela being led out of her house, eyes cast down, wrists cuffed. Joe poured 2 cups. To property lines, he said. I raised mine. And to never backing down. The sun crested over the treetops. My land, every inch of it was mine again. And this time no one would dare try to take it. The morning fog was still lifting off the hills when I got the letter from the county prosecutor's office. Official seal, heavy stock paper, no nonsense language. It wasn't addressed to me personally. This one was a public notice. The criminal proceedings against Pamela Dritch and 4 of her board members were moving forward to indictment. Indictment meant a grand jury found enough evidence to proceed with felony charges. Not just attempted fraud. Not just trespassing. The list had grown. Conspiracy to commit land theft, falsification of legal documents, impersonation of a public official, and unlawful use of municipal resources. That last one caught my attention. I didn't realize the depth of it until I met with investigator Rourke again. She pulled up to my shop unannounced in a dusty state-issued pickup. She stepped out with a new folder, thicker than before, and a face that looked like she hadn't slept much. They weren't just faking paperwork, she said, handing me a photo. They were using internal county access to edit GIS boundary lines temporarily, so it would look like they had jurisdiction. I stared at the image. It showed a computer screen displaying the county's land parcel database, the live one used by assessors. My property line was shifted by about 20 feet on the north edge. The same side where Pamela and her crew had planted those flags. They had a contact in the zoning office, Rourke said. A part-time tech who was feeding them access credentials. That's how they updated the overlay without triggering an audit. Is that guy under arrest? Already in custody. He confessed as soon as we confronted him. Claimed he was told it was part of a planned expansion phase, approved by the county. I leaned back against the workbench. So they were hacking the county system to make it look like I was in their HOA? They weren't smart enough to call it hacking, she said. But yes. And the moment we pulled up the database logs, it was clear. Access timestamps, login trails, and the altered files. All traced back to Pamela's laptop. I let that settle in. It wasn't just fraud now, it was tampering with public infrastructure. That's prison time. They made one more move before the arrest, Rourke added. Filed a civil suit against the county for failing to enforce their charter rights. It was tossed immediately, but it shows how delusional they were. By that point, word had spread beyond our county. A local news station did a segment on the scandal, and it got picked up by a regional network. I watched it one evening on Joe's TV. The anchor stood outside the now-defunct Oak Hollow Estates office, where a closed-by-court-order sign was duct-taped across the door. The camera panned to residents walking past, shaking their heads. One woman, maybe in her 40s, told the reporter, "We just wanted a quiet place to live. We didn't sign up for land grabs and fake fines." The coverage ended with a clip of Pamela being led into the courthouse, stone-faced and silent, her cardigan replaced by a gray suit jacket 2 sizes too large. Joe turned to me after the segment ended. "You're a welder. Since when did you start dismantling criminal empires?" I shrugged. "Guess I just hate being told what to do by people who didn't earn it." The week before the trial, I got a letter in the mail, this one handwritten. It was from a former Oak Hollow board member, someone who'd resigned a year earlier and had refused to participate in Pamela's expansion schemes. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. "I knew something was off," it read. "When they started holding meetings without minutes and locking out residents who asked too many questions, I should have gone to the authorities. I hope what's coming brings you peace." I didn't need his apology, but I appreciated it all the same. The trial began in the county courthouse, a dull brick building that sat across from the river. I sat in the back row the first day, arms crossed, listening as the prosecutor laid out the charges. The courtroom was packed with Oak Hollow residents, reporters, and a few city officials who'd been blindsided by the depth of the scheme. Pamela's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been misled by others on the board, that she hadn't known the forged documents were forged, or that the tech guy had altered the GIS system without her knowledge. But the prosecution had emails. Dozens of them. In one, Pamela wrote, "Once we get the new lines in, enforce hard. Start with the welder. He'll buckle. I didn't buckle." And now she was the one looking at a courtroom full of people who finally saw through her facade. Testimony lasted for 2 weeks. The GIS tech took the stand and admitted everything. A former HOA treasurer testified that Pamela had ordered him to shred complaints and fabricate meeting records. Even Calvin Price, the man who started the dissolution movement, stood up and gave his account of how the board locked out dissenters and manipulated residents through fear. The jury took less than a day to deliberate. Guilty. On all counts, Pamela was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with no chance of parole for at least 8. 3 of her board members received between 5 and 7 years each. The zoning tech, who had cooperated fully, got 2 years probation and community service. The judge's final statement was broadcast on the courthouse steps. No institution, no matter how small or local, has the right to override the law. This court finds the abuse of authority displayed by the Oak Hollow Board to be not only unlawful, but corrosive to the public trust. It was over, but the cleanup was still underway. In the aftermath, the county commission dissolved Oak Hollow's HOA completely. Not just suspended, gone. Their articles of incorporation were revoked, their bank accounts frozen, and their remaining funds redistributed to a community trust that would be overseen by a neutral third party. Lila helped draft the final agreement. She refused payment for her time but accepted a steel-forged nameplate I made for her office door. It said, "Attorney at Law Hammer of HOAs." The residents of Oak Hollow held a neighborhood gathering a few weeks later. No board members. No agendas, just families and neighbors. They invited me and Joe, and though we weren't technically part of the community, we showed up with a cooler and lawn chairs. People were different now. Lighter. One guy brought his guitar and played old country songs while kids rode bikes down the street, chalking smiley faces on the pavement. No one complained. I stood near the fire pit as dusk settled in, watching the flames dance against the twilight. A man I hadn't met before approached, holding a paper plate stacked with ribs. "You're the guy who stood up to them," he said. "I'm the guy who refused to move a fence," I replied. He chuckled. "Well, you ended up moving a whole regime instead. I didn't need thanks. I didn't need recognition. I just wanted my land, my peace, and the knowledge that people like Pamela couldn't get away with it again." I drove home that night with the windows down, the wind warm and soft. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw the new sign I'd mounted near the gate. Private property. No easements. No exceptions. Below it, just in case anyone had any lingering ideas, I added a second line. "We know the law and we don't blink." Then I walked into my workshop, turned off the outside lights, and let the silence of a free man's land settle around me.